The opposing attorney let out a short laugh the moment Charlotte walked toward the plaintiff's table carrying a worn leather folder and no assistant beside her. He called her a desperate single mother clinging to a company through emotion alone, then asked the court to dismiss the entire case outright. Behind her, Mason tightened his grip on the bench when she said nothing in response to the insult. But the judge paused on the final page of her file, studied her for a long moment, and read her full legal name aloud to the courtroom. The room went completely silent. If you want to know how one last name turned an entire courtroom upside down, please stay until the end. The story began at the Franklin County Commercial Court on a cold, rainy Monday morning, in a hearing room that smelled faintly of wet coats and old paper. Charlotte Bennett walked in almost entirely alone, without a communications team trailing behind her and without the corporate legal squad that usually surrounded a chief executive. Her lead attorney had withdrawn 2 days earlier, citing a conflict of interest that nobody had bothered to explain in detail. In truth, Charlotte had been carefully isolated, one relationship at a time, until almost no one remained willing to stand beside her. 3 weeks earlier, the board of Bennett Aerospace Components had voted to suspend her as chief executive after the chief financial officer, Logan Pierce, presented documents suggesting she had used company funds to conceal mounting losses. Charlotte filed suit immediately, hoping to block the board from selling a controlling stake to an outside investment group called Hayes Capital. If she lost this hearing, the sale could be finalized within hours, and everything her family had built over decades would pass into other hands. Mason Carter sat near the back of the courtroom, not because he was a lawyer but because he refused to let her face the room by herself. Mason was the lead quality control engineer at Bennett Aerospace, and one of the very few employees who still believed in Charlotte without hesitation. Months earlier, he had warned her about a string of titanium purchases whose specifications did not add up. The company had paid for premium aviation-grade material, yet inspection records suggested some of those shipments had never actually passed through the production line at all. Charlotte began quietly investigating the discrepancy on her own, asking careful questions instead of raising alarms. 2 days later, she was suspended, and Mason understood immediately that the timing was not a coincidence. Attorney Adrian Hayes rose to speak for the shareholder group pushing to remove her, and he turned the hearing into something closer to a public humiliation. He brought up her divorce in front of strangers, and the fact that she had raised a family largely on her own. He reminded the room that the board no longer stood behind her, listing names as though reading a verdict. Then he suggested that Charlotte was turning a straightforward business dispute into what he called the emotional last stand of a single mother, terrified of losing the only thing she had left. Charlotte did not react outwardly, keeping her expression as still as the polished table in front of her. Mason noticed her knuckles whiten around her pen, the only visible sign that the words had landed at all. This was the exact moment the audience had already witnessed from the opening of the story. Adrian asked the court to dismiss the case in its entirety, confident that no judge would want to wade further into a family matter dressed up as corporate law. Judge Samuel Bennett turned the pages of her file, slower than before, and stopped. He looked at the name on the final page for a long moment before speaking. Charlotte Eleanor Bennett, he read aloud, letting the syllables settle across the room like a held breath. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift, and even the court reporter paused with her hands above the keys. Judge Bennett looked up and asked, very slowly, whether Bennett Aerospace had been founded by a man named Joseph Bennett. Charlotte answered simply that it had, her voice steady even as something tightened behind her eyes. Adrian allowed himself a small smile, assuming this was nothing more than a procedural formality. But the judge asked one more question, wanting to know exactly what Joseph Bennett was to her. Charlotte hesitated for a single breath before answering that he was her grandfather. Mason went very still in his seat, and for the first time that morning, Adrian's confident expression faltered. The true turning point of the case, however, had not yet arrived, and none of them fully understood how far the answer would eventually reach. Judge Samuel Bennett moved quickly to clarify that he shared no close family connection with Charlotte, since the surname was common enough across the state. Still, the mention of Joseph Bennett had triggered something he recognized from an obscure corner of corporate law he had studied decades earlier. Long before Bennett Aerospace became a company with dozens of shareholders, Joseph Bennett had established what was known as a Founder Protection Trust, a legal mechanism designed to stop the business from being sold off without the consent of a direct heir. The clause had rarely been invoked in modern memory, buried under layers of later mergers and restructuring. Its existence, if still valid, would change the entire shape of the case unfolding in front of him. Adrian objected at once, insisting that the trust must have expired decades ago along with the rest of the founding paperwork. Charlotte herself looked genuinely surprised, since her father had always told her that most of the family's controlling authority had long since passed to the board. Judge Bennett declined to rule immediately, instead ordering both sides to produce every document connected to the trust before the end of the day. In the span of a single question, the hearing stopped being about whether Charlotte had mismanaged the company. It became a question of whether Hayes Capital ever had the legal right to buy it in the first place. Adrian lost his composure for the first time since the hearing began, shuffling papers that suddenly seemed less useful than before. Mason noticed Logan Pierce sitting several rows back, his head bent over his phone, typing rapidly and without pause. When the hearing broke for recess, Mason caught up with Charlotte in the hallway outside the courtroom, the marble floor echoing under their footsteps. He asked her, gently, why she had never once mentioned being the founder's granddaughter in all the years they had worked together. She told him it was because she wanted people to hear the name Charlotte before they ever heard the name Bennett. Mason found himself looking at her differently after that admission, reconsidering everything he thought he understood about how she had become chief executive. He had always assumed the board selected her purely on merit, never imagining she had spent years deliberately avoiding the weight of her own family history. Charlotte, in turn, asked him a question that mattered even more than the one he had just asked her. She wanted to know if he was absolutely certain about the irregular titanium invoices he had flagged months earlier, because everything now rested on the strength of that evidence. Mason told her he was more than certain. He explained that he had gone back and cross-checked every shipment code against internal records, line by line, late into several nights. 3 separate titanium shipments, worth nearly $8 million combined, were listed as delivered to the Columbus production facility. Yet the warehouse security footage showed no matching deliveries arriving on any of those dates, no trucks, no pallets, nothing at all. Charlotte understood the implication immediately, her stomach tightening as the pieces slid into place. If that money had been quietly diverted elsewhere, someone could be manufacturing fake losses to drive down the company's valuation before Hayes Capital finalized its purchase. Both of them began to realize this was no longer simply a boardroom power struggle dressed up in legal language. It looked increasingly like outright financial fraud, carefully engineered and carefully hidden behind legitimate-looking paperwork. Charlotte wanted to call federal investigators immediately, unwilling to wait another day while evidence might disappear. Mason urged caution instead, reminding her that they still lacked enough proof to make the case airtight. If Logan realized they were closing in, he warned, he could erase the remaining records before anyone had the chance to secure them. Charlotte agreed to keep fighting inside the courtroom for now, while Mason quietly searched for something Logan believed no one still had access to. That evening, Mason returned to the production facility long after most of the staff had gone home, the parking lot nearly empty under a thin drizzle. He had no intention of breaking into any protected computer system or doing anything that might jeopardize the case they were building. Instead, he focused on the kind of technical infrastructure that the finance department rarely thought to examine closely. Every truck delivering aviation-grade materials to Bennett Aerospace had to pass through an independent weighing system before it was cleared to enter the warehouse. Logan could alter invoices, and he could alter internal database entries, but the weighing system belonged to an outside vendor that maintained its own separate, tamper-resistant records. Mason spent hours cross-referencing 6 months of weighing data against the shipment logs Logan's team had filed with accounting. Not a single truck during that period carried a weight consistent with the 3 disputed titanium shipments. As he dug further, he uncovered something even more troubling buried inside the certification paperwork attached to those same shipments. Several material certification codes matched a supplier facility that had actually closed its doors nearly 2 years earlier, meaning the documents had almost certainly been copied from older, unrelated filings. Mason immediately sent everything he had compiled directly to Charlotte, unwilling to sit on it even one more night. She called him within minutes, her voice tight with a mixture of vindication and dread. The two of them agreed to meet at a small diner near the plant rather than risk being seen together at either office. It was here, away from boardrooms and courtrooms, that Charlotte saw Mason outside the context of work for the first time in years of knowing him. He did not talk much about his personal life, but she already knew he had raised his child alone after losing his wife. She asked him quietly why he was willing to put his entire career at risk for her sake. Mason answered that he had personally signed off on those quality reports years earlier, and if someone was now using his name to help hide fraud, then this fight belonged to him too. Charlotte realized in that moment that he was not simply trying to rescue her from a difficult situation. He was defending something he believed in, regardless of who benefited from that defense, and that distinction mattered enormously to her. It was that quiet sense of principle rather than any grand gesture that made her trust him completely. After a long pause, Mason asked what she intended to do if she managed to win back control of the company. She told him, without hesitation, that she intended to find out exactly who had sold it from the inside. The two of them agreed not to alert the board just yet, deciding instead that Charlotte would introduce the new evidence directly at the next hearing. That plan lasted only until the following morning, when everything shifted without warning. Mason arrived at work to find his access badge deactivated at the front gate, security waving him aside before he could even reach the lobby. Logan had accused him of accessing confidential company data without authorization, filing a formal complaint before Charlotte even knew what had happened. Adrian, sensing an opportunity, filed an emergency motion asking the court to exclude every piece of evidence Mason had gathered, arguing it had been obtained illegally. Charlotte understood immediately what this meant. Logan already knew exactly what they were doing, and he had moved to cut them off before they could present anything at all. What had started as a quiet, careful investigation had suddenly turned into something closer to a hunt, with both sides racing to outmaneuver the other before the next hearing began. The second hearing carried a sharper edge than the first, the room noticeably fuller as word of the Founder Protection Trust had begun to spread through the company. Adrian no longer mocking Charlotte directly, since that approach had already backfired once. Instead, he redirected his focus entirely toward Mason, painting him as a disgruntled employee helping a former chief executive settle a personal score against the board. Adrian asked, in front of everyone, whether Mason had any romantic involvement with Charlotte. Mason answered plainly that he did not, keeping his voice level despite the obvious attempt to rattle him. Adrian pressed further, asking whether Mason wished that he did. Charlotte's head snapped up at the question, though Mason himself never lost his composure for even a moment. He simply asked, in return, what that question had to do with delivery weight records or shipment codes. A few quiet laughs rippled through the gallery, and Judge Samuel firmly instructed Adrian to return to the substance of his argument. Adrian pivoted, insisting again that Mason had accessed protected systems after his suspension had already taken effect, hoping the technical timeline alone might be enough to disqualify the evidence. Mason calmly explained that his access to the weighing records had occurred well before any official suspension notice was issued to him. More importantly, he pointed out that the independent weighing system was never under Bennett Aerospace's direct control in the first place. It belonged to a third-party vendor, and his authorization to review its records had existed as part of his quality role for several years already. Judge Samuel agreed to consider the evidence on its merits rather than excluding it on a technicality. The disputed titanium shipments, worth nearly $8 million combined, were placed formally into the court record. Charlotte followed with wire transfer documentation showing exactly where the money had gone. The funds had been routed to a distribution company called Northline Materials, one that appeared on paper to be a completely ordinary supplier. Adrian argued that Northline was simply a legitimate vendor and nothing more, waving off the connection as coincidental. Charlotte asked a direct question in response, wanting to know who actually owned Northline behind its corporate registration. Nobody in the room offered an immediate answer, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Judge Samuel ordered the business registration filings to be produced before the hearing continued any further. What emerged surprised almost everyone present, since Northline turned out to be owned by another limited liability company entirely. That company, in turn, traced back to a trust registered out of state, one layer removed from anyone in the room. Charlotte had not yet identified the person standing at the very end of that ownership chain, though she suspected it would not remain hidden for long. Logan sat near the back, outwardly composed, betraying nothing through his posture or his expression. Then Mason quietly passed Charlotte a single sheet of paper he had been holding back until exactly this moment. On an older shipping certificate, Northline had listed the same emergency contact number as an entirely different company altogether. Charlotte recognized the number instantly, her pulse quickening as the connection became clear. It belonged to the family office of Catherine Hayes, Adrian's own sister and the executive who ran Hayes Capital. Adrian immediately claimed he had no knowledge of Northline whatsoever, his voice a fraction too fast to sound entirely convincing. Judge Samuel studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking again. The hearing had shifted from a straightforward corporate dispute into something that now potentially implicated the very attorney representing the opposing side. Samuel asked Adrian to confirm, under oath, that he held no financial interest in Northline Materials whatsoever. Adrian hesitated, just barely, for no more than 2 seconds before answering. Those 2 seconds were more than enough for Mason to understand exactly how deep this went, and exactly how dangerous the truth had become for the people trying to bury it. Charlotte and Mason continued pursuing the investigation through entirely proper legal means, unwilling to give Adrian any further ammunition to challenge their credibility. Their new counsel filed a motion demanding the exchange of communications between Hayes Capital, Logan Pierce, and Northline Materials. Judge Samuel granted a portion of the request, ordering a limited but meaningful set of records to be released within days. The first batch of emails arrived and appeared, at first glance, frustratingly unremarkable. Logan had clearly been careful, choosing his words in ways that avoided anything overtly incriminating on the surface. Still, Mason kept reading late into the night, searching for patterns rather than obvious mistakes. He eventually found a thread of messages labeled with a bland subject line about inventory rationalization, buried among dozens of routine internal exchanges. One sentence in particular caught Charlotte's attention the moment she read it herself. It stated plainly that once valuation fell below the trust threshold, founder protection would become irrelevant to the transaction. Charlotte understood immediately what that single line actually meant for everything that had happened over the previous months. Hayes Capital had known about the Founder Protection Trust long before this hearing ever exposed it publicly. The manufactured losses were never simply about forcing Charlotte out of her position as chief executive. They were designed carefully and deliberately to drag the company's valuation down below a specific legal threshold. Under the original trust language, founder protection only activated once a proposed acquisition exceeded a minimum price based on independently adjusted assets. Hayes Capital had engineered fake losses specifically to push that valuation beneath the line before anyone noticed what they were doing, but they had made one critical miscalculation in their plan. The valuation defined inside the trust was never based on internal financial reporting controlled by company management. It relied instead on an independent asset valuation conducted by a neutral third party outside anyone's influence. Joseph Bennett had written that clause nearly 4 decades earlier, long before anyone in the courtroom that day had even been born. Charlotte finally understood, sitting in that hearing room, exactly why her grandfather had built such a complicated safeguard into the company's foundation. He had feared even then that people from inside the business might one day try to sell it out from under the family for far less than it was worth. Adrian objected furiously, insisting that no legitimate trustee remained to enforce such an outdated provision. Judge Samuel asked a simple, direct question in response, wanting to know who the surviving direct beneficiary of the trust actually was. Charlotte rose to her feet and answered that it was her. Yet she made a point of telling the court exactly what she was not asking for. She was not requesting that control be handed back to her purely because of her bloodline or her family name. She was asking only that the proposed sale be halted long enough for the fraud underneath it to be properly investigated. That distinction shifted something in Judge Samuel's expression, and Mason noticed it too, watching her from his seat with quiet admiration. After the hearing ended, Charlotte admitted privately to Mason that she was no longer certain she even wanted to remain chief executive once everything was resolved. When he asked her why, she said she no longer knew whether people had once followed her because she was right, or simply because of the name printed above the door. Mason told her, honestly, that he had never once known what her surname was worth until this case forced everyone to confront it directly. She looked at him and asked, quietly, why he had chosen to stand behind her despite everything. He answered simply that she was the only person who had ever asked him what the data actually showed before asking how it might affect a stock price. It was a small, understated moment between them, built on trust rather than declaration, with no dramatic gesture attached to it. Just as the tension between them finally eased, Charlotte's phone lit up with news that shattered the calm entirely. Logan Pierce had disappeared without a trace sometime overnight. and a backup server at company headquarters had just been wiped clean before anyone could secure it. For a moment, Charlotte feared they had just lost the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. But Mason remembered an old procedure that almost everyone else at the company had long since forgotten about. 2 years earlier, following a minor system failure, the quality department had required that every material certification be synchronized weekly with an offline audit archive as a safeguard. That archive was never stored at company headquarters, but at a smaller testing facility located roughly an hour outside Columbus. Logan, focused entirely on erasing the primary servers, likely had no idea the secondary archive even still existed. Mason and Charlotte did not attempt to retrieve the data themselves under any circumstances. Instead, they immediately informed Charlotte's new legal counsel and requested an emergency order to preserve whatever evidence remained intact. Judge Samuel signed the emergency order without delay, understanding exactly how much was riding on the outcome. An independent forensic specialist was dispatched to the facility within hours to secure the archive before anyone else could reach it. The backup was still there, untouched and fully intact, exactly where the old procedure had left it years earlier. The recovered data revealed dozens of certification records that had been quietly altered over time. It was not limited to the 3 disputed titanium shipments that had first drawn Mason's attention months earlier. In total, more than $30 million had been funneled through a network of shell companies designed to obscure its final destination. A significant portion of that money eventually traced back to a fund controlled by Catherine Hayes. Another portion led directly to accounts connected to Logan Pierce personally, confirming exactly what Charlotte and Mason had long suspected about his involvement. An even bigger shock, however, was still waiting to surface. Adrian Hayes had personally sent Logan detailed instructions on how transactions should be structured so they would not trigger the founder protection clause buried in the original trust. Adrian could no longer credibly claim ignorance of any of it, not with his own written words sitting in front of the court. At the final hearing, Judge Samuel asked him directly to explain the messages now entered into evidence. Adrian attempted to frame it as ordinary legal advice, nothing more than standard corporate guidance offered to a client. Charlotte then produced the complete email chain, laying out the full context line by line for the record. One particular message from Adrian read that if she began digging too deeply, she needed to be removed before she located the founding documents herself. The courtroom fell into complete silence as those words settled over everyone present. Charlotte looked directly at Adrian, the same man who had once mocked her as an incapable single mother clinging desperately to a company. Now he was the one struggling to explain why he had personally helped orchestrate her removal from it in the first place. Judge Samuel announced that the case file would be referred to prosecutors given the clear indications of criminal conduct uncovered during discovery. Adrian was formally disqualified from representing any party in the matter due to an unmistakable and severe conflict of interest. Hayes Capital's counsel requested a continuance, hoping to buy time before the consequences became final. Judge Samuel denied the request without hesitation, unwilling to delay a matter this serious any further. He then turned his attention back to the central legal question the entire case had ultimately hinged upon from the very beginning, the true legitimacy of the proposed acquisition itself. Charlotte sat quietly through this last exchange, aware that the hardest part of the fight was finally behind her, even if the paperwork ahead would take months to resolve. Mason watched from the gallery, thinking not of vindication but of the long, careful nights spent cross-referencing shipment codes that had finally led to this exact moment. Neither of them spoke of celebration just yet, both instinctively understanding that a courtroom victory and a fully repaired company were not quite the same thing. Still, for the first time in weeks, the weight in the room felt different, lighter somehow, as though the truth itself had finally been allowed to breathe. Judge Samuel laid out his preliminary findings with the same measured tone he had maintained throughout the entire proceeding. The founder protection, he confirmed, remained fully valid and enforceable under the original terms Joseph Bennett had written decades earlier. Charlotte stood as the sole surviving direct beneficiary entitled to invoke its protections. But the more consequential finding concerned the conduct of Hayes Capital itself throughout the entire transaction. The evidence clearly showed a deliberate effort to manipulate the company's valuation in order to circumvent the very safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of takeover. As a result, the proposed acquisition was suspended indefinitely, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation now underway. The board of Bennett Aerospace was formally barred from transferring any controlling interest to Hayes Capital under the current circumstances. All accounts connected to the suspicious transactions were frozen while investigators completed their work. Charlotte had won decisively and completely, though the moment carried none of the triumph she might once have expected. Judge Samuel, however, was not quite finished speaking to the room. He looked directly at Charlotte before continuing, choosing his next words with obvious deliberation. He repeated, almost verbatim, the phrase Adrian had once used to mock her in that very same courtroom weeks earlier. "A desperate single mother clinging to a company through emotion alone," he said, letting the words hang in the air for a long moment. Then he stated plainly that the evidence showed something entirely different from what Adrian had once claimed. Ms. Bennett was never trying to hold on to this company through sentiment, he said, but rather to stop others from taking it through outright fraud. Adrian lowered his head, saying nothing in response. Charlotte did not celebrate, offering no visible reaction beyond a long, quiet exhale. Mason remained seated near the back, watching her with the same steady patience he had shown from the very first day of the hearing. Judge Samuel added one final observation before formally closing the proceeding for the day. The Bennett name, he said, had opened an important legal question, but it was the evidence itself that ultimately decided the outcome of the case. That single distinction carried the true meaning of everything that had unfolded across the past several weeks. Charlotte had not won because she carried the Bennett name into that courtroom. The name had simply forced Judge Samuel to reconsider a legal provision that someone had worked very hard to keep buried and forgotten. Charlotte won because Mason had found the evidence, and because the conspiracy underneath it had genuinely existed all along. Outside, reporters waited in a small, restless crowd near the courthouse steps, cameras raised and questions already shouted before she had even reached the doors. Charlotte declined to answer most of the personal questions thrown at her about her family history. She offered only one brief statement before continuing toward her car. Bennett Aerospace would continue operating, she said, and anyone who had taken money from the company would be required to return it in full. Mason began walking toward a side exit, ready to slip away quietly before the crowd noticed him. Charlotte called out and asked where exactly he thought he was going at a moment like this. He told her he was simply heading home, since he assumed he would need to start looking for new work the following morning. Charlotte raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the suggestion. She asked if he genuinely believed she would let the person who had just saved the company from $30 million in fraud walk away unemployed. Mason replied that he had not saved the company at all. Charlotte smiled, conceding the point with a small nod, and said that fine, he had simply saved the data instead. For the first time in weeks, Mason actually laughed, and something between them finally began to feel a little lighter. 6 months passed, and the changes at Bennett Aerospace settled into something steadier and far more transparent than before. Logan Pierce faced formal criminal charges connected to fraud and embezzlement, with the case moving slowly through the court system. The investigation into Catherine and Adrian Hayes continued as well, though the finer legal details mattered far less than the outcome already achieved for the company. Charlotte was invited back by a newly reconstituted board to resume her role as chief executive, this time under very different terms than before. She agreed, but only after setting several conditions of her own that the board accepted without argument. An independent audit committee was established, answering directly to shareholders rather than to management alone. Engineers and technical staff were given the right to report irregularities straight to that committee, bypassing management layers that had once allowed fraud to hide undisturbed. Mason was offered the newly created role of vice president overseeing quality and safety across every facility the company operated. He initially declined, uncomfortable with the formality of the title itself. Charlotte simply asked him whether he wanted what had happened before to ever happen again. Mason accepted the position shortly afterward, unable to argue with her reasoning. Both of them continued devoting most of their personal time to their families, refusing to rush 2 separate lives together before they were ready. The relationship between them developed slowly and quietly, without any dramatic public announcement inside the company. Few of their colleagues could say with any certainty exactly when the two of them had first begun spending time together outside of work. One Friday evening after the final meeting of a long week, Charlotte and Mason returned to the same small diner where they had once reviewed the disputed titanium paperwork together. Charlotte set her old, worn leather folder down on the table between them, the same one she had carried into that very first hearing. Mason asked why she still bothered keeping it around after everything that had happened since. She told him it reminded her of the day a lawyer had once assumed she had nothing to offer beyond a sympathetic story. Mason replied simply that the man had been wrong about her twice over. Charlotte asked what the first mistake had been. Mason said that she had never actually been someone deserving of pity in the first place. She asked what the second mistake was, watching him carefully across the table. He told her that she had never been defined by the Bennett name alone, and never would be. Charlotte did not answer right away, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them for a moment. Then she reached her hand across the table, and Mason took it without hesitation. There was no grand declaration between them, no dramatic proposal marking the moment as something rehearsed or planned. It was simply two people who had spent years learning to stand entirely on their own, finally allowing themselves to lean on someone else. Charlotte glanced out toward the window, watching the evening traffic pass quietly along the street outside. 6 months earlier, an entire courtroom had gone silent the instant a judge read her family name aloud for the first time. Now that same name no longer defined who she truly was, and for the first time in years that felt like enough. Charlotte had spent most of her career trying to prove she deserved the chief executive's chair without ever leaning on the Bennett family name. In the end, it was this very case that taught her running from her own history was no different from letting that history quietly control her instead. Mason learned something similar about himself along the way. He had spent years defining himself only as a father and as an engineer determined to do things the right way, nothing more. Charlotte never once asked him to become anyone other than exactly who he already was. And Charlotte, in turn, never needed someone to rescue her from what she was facing. She simply needed one person steady enough to stand beside her when an entire room had already assumed she had lost. The Bennett name had forced a judge to reopen a legal provision that someone had worked very hard to bury. But it was the truth itself that ultimately tipped the scales of justice in her favor. And in the end, that same truth was what finally brought Charlotte and Mason together.